Good evening, everybody. Hello. My name's Allerton. I'm the head of the Department of Anthropology, and I'm also an associate of the Southeast Asia Centre here at the LSE. So on behalf of the Saw-Sweehawk Southeast Asia Centre, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's event. The event is co-hosted with the Departments of Anthropology and Geography and Environment. And we're delighted to welcome Professor Tania Murray-Lee, who will be speaking about transforming rural Southeast Asia. Just a few housekeeping points. The event is being recorded today, just bear that in mind. For anyone attending online via LSE Live, please post any questions you have using the Q&A function and include your name, affiliation, location, and of course your question. And if anyone feels like tweeting about this event, please be sure to tag at LSE SEAC. So without further ado, let me just very briefly introduce Tania. Tania Murray-Lee is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Her work deals with a range of fascinating and urgent themes, including land, labour, class, capitalism, resources, indigeneity, politics, and plantations. Her publications include Land's End, Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier, the co-authored Powers of Exclusion, Land Dilemmas in Southeast Asia, and The Will to Improve Governmentality, Development, and the Practice of Politics. And her most recent book is Plantation Life, Corporate Occupation of Indonesia's Oil Palm Zone, co-authored with Pujo Sumedi. And although I think her PhD fieldwork was undertaken in Singapore, for the last 3 decades, her research has been focused on rural Indonesia. So welcome, Tania. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks to the Southeast Asia Centre and Geography and Anthropology for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out for an evening talk. What do I do? Sorry? You can also use this. I'm sorry. Okay, got it. Super. So my theme today, transforming rural Southeast Asia. So if you have an idea of my work, I've been very kind of rigid and dogged in continuing to keep a focus on rural Southeast Asia in a period in which, in my discipline, anthropology, but also I think in some other fields, the attention and the excitement seem to be focusing to the city, to migration, to other themes and topics. But I've always been aware that at least half the world's population continues to live and gain their livelihood in rural areas, and I've kind of made it my job to kind of try to keep those areas in focus and try to bring to light what's going on in such rural spaces. So as you would have seen in the sort of introduction for the talk, I looked this up, and although the proportion of people living in rural areas is declining globally, the net number continues to rise. So from 3 billion in 1990 to 3.4 billion in 2020. And in Southeast Asia, the area of my focus, 30 million more people live and work in rural areas today than they did in 1990. So even though the proportion is becoming urban, the net number continues to increase. So there's more and more people, in fact, living and trying to survive in rural areas under conditions which are clearly not the same as those under which their grandparents lived. But there they are, and the questions that I've been asking are, well, what's happening to them? What are the transformations that are underway in their domains? What kinds of aspirations, practices, processes, and so on could we attend to if we made them the focus of our analysis? So one of the reasons, we first have to ask ourselves, like, how does the rural get to be so neglected? And I think it's partly the excitement of the urban and the idea that that's the future, but it's also what I think of as a very stubborn transition narrative, which is endemic in a field like development studies, but it's also present in other spheres as well, the idea that there's some sort of inevitable march of progress, some kind of a transition that sooner or later will happen to all people and all places, from country to city, from farm to factory, from informal work to the proper job. You know, those kinds of transitions are, although we've critiqued them in the academic literature repeatedly, they are very stubborn, and they continue to govern both the narratives of development agencies, but also the thinking of national governments. So I first became really aware of this in 2006, reading the World Bank's report on agriculture, which actually lined up all the nations of the world along what they called a transition path, you know, where you had the kind of the stuck ones and then the transforming ones, and then it's like there's one linear transition and every country of the world is located somewhere on this path, as if the same set of transformations could be expected to occur in each and every country. But I asked myself, first of all, there's the artifact of the national frame. It may be that industrial jobs are being created, but if they're being created in China, that's of precious little use to you if you're being shoved off your land in Kalimantan, for example, right? This idea that within each and every country, this march from country to city and to sort of into the proper job would somehow just emerge as part of some natural unfolding seemed to me, you know, completely mistaken. But I think it is still a dominant narrative. And because I think of this problematic transition narrative, it seems to suggest that, and people have said this to me in my career, like, that's such boring, old-fashioned stuff. Like, you know, no one cares about agrarian transitions. No one cares about the rurals. Like, no one will ever read your work. It's just like that boring old peasant studies. And I've you know, stuck with it because I'm pretty convinced that it continues to be important, right? To look at what's happening to that portion of the world and to pay attention to who those people are and how their lives are transforming. So just to show you a little bit what this looks like, I'm going to try to show you what this looks like. Yes, okay. So this is a graph of Southeast Asia's rural population. And what you will see is the total rural population went from 302 million in 1990 to 333 million in 2020. So the percentage of rural people is declining, but the net number continues to increase. And clearly you can see from this graph that it's not the same across the region. So in Indonesia, more or less static. Malaysia definitely has a net declining rural population. In Myanmar, in the Philippines, still increasing. In Vietnam, still increasing. So it's not a uniform picture, but nevertheless, you know, taken together, the rural continues to be very important. And although I'm going to talk mainly about Indonesia today, you know, it's like in a context in which even the things that I'm describing are not uniform across the region, and I wouldn't claim they are. Just, it's worth thinking briefly about Malaysia because it will come into my talk later where I'm going to focus a little bit on plantation sector. So in Malaysia, there has been what I would call a real agrarian transition, as in young people really have left the countryside, they really have marched off to the cities. Large parts of rural Malaysia are depopulated. What's there now are plantations, and most of the people who work in those plantations are Indonesian migrant workers and sometimes Bangladeshis and others. But basically, young Malaysians, by and large, do not live or work in the countryside. So, you know, the transition narrative works for Malaysia, but it doesn't work for Indonesia, the country next door, where the conditions are really very different. Okay, so that's the big topic. And so as we try to make sense of what is changing in rural areas, sorry, still not. I'm going to draw briefly on this work which Catherine kindly mentioned earlier, work that I did together with a political scientist and a geographer, Derek Hall and Phil Hirsch. So focusing in on the land question, you know, of many things which are changing, I'm going to focus for a while now on what's changing in relationship to land. That's a key resource, obviously, in rural economies. And what we tried to do in our work, which was comparative across the Southeast Asian region, was to understand what is actually changing in people's relationship to land and how is it changing? What are the processes, what are the powers at work? So in terms of, still very sticky, in terms of the processes. So we did this work inductively, looking across the Southeast Asian region. I know I have certain expertise in kind of Indonesia and Malaysia. Phil works in Thailand, in the Mekong region. Derek has a specialization in the Philippines. So the first question we asked ourselves is, what are the processes which are shaping patterns of access to land? Like, what is actually, what kinds of things are going on in the countryside which are changing people's access? So one process is formalization. So right across the Southeast Asian region, you see programs, whether it's to do with land titling or mapping or zoning, but there is a lot of intervention in which state agencies of different kinds are placing new boundaries, new rules, new ways in which the old kind of informal practices of access to land are being replaced by more formal state-backed arrangements. So that's one thing. Another thing which is happening right across the region is the rise of conservation as a set of practices. So the amount of land which is set aside in conservation areas has been increasing, but so too has the effort and especially the donor funding put into the actual maintenance of forest boundaries. So in the context of concerns about climate change and deforestation and so on, conservation has become a major element changing people's access to land. Like, you can no longer just treat the forest as your land frontier. There was perhaps long a boundary there, but no one really enforced it. Now those kinds of conservation-related boundaries are becoming more solid, protected areas, and even things like community-based resource management. Even at the village level, people are being encouraged or sometimes obliged to set aside areas for conservation. So the rise of conservation is actually changing people's access to land across the region. A third process is what we called in the book non-agrarian land uses, or post-agrarian land uses. So mines, dams, logging concessions, special economic zones, infrastructure projects, and peri-urban real estate development. You imagine in the outskirts of Hanoi, for example, rice fields with apartment blocks in the middle of them as someone has managed to get hold of a parcel of rural land and transform it for real estate. So these kinds of processes are also part of the dynamic. The fourth one, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit because it's actually my real area of expertise, is crop booms. So this is also the kind of thing which changes people's relationships across large areas. So in much of the Mekong area, rubber has been a boom crop, both among smallholders and large-scale corporations coming in to do rubber. Oil palm, obviously. Shrimp farms, massive areas of Thailand, other parts of the Mekong, converted into shrimp agriculture, coffee, cocoa. So boom crops have been changing people's access because in the context of a boom, land suddenly has a new value, people take a new interest in it, new actors coming on the scene, wanting to get hold of it, wanting to turn it to new purposes. So that's another process which has been occurring. The fifth one, what we called intimate exclusions. So that's an old process. It's an age-old process, which has to do with the kind of petty capitalist processes of accumulation. When I asked a bunch of land activists in Myanmar, what was the main element in their loss of access to land, was it military land grabs or was it debt? Like the ordinary kind of debt to the neighborhood moneylender. And they said, the military is the drama, but the actual process through which most of them have lost access to land is debt. And that has to do with, the kind of the grind of petty capitalist production and, people not being able to make ends meet. taking loans, mortgaging land, losing land, often to their neighbours and their kin and to people in the village. So we call that in the book intimate exclusions. It's the small-scale processes which are also very prominent. And the sixth one is what we called ethno-territorial claims. And this is a process which has been very strongly marked across the region in the last 2 or 3 decades. The rise of movements claiming to have priority in access to land based on identity. So we, the indigenous people, or we, the kind of the ethnic group that properly belongs here, whereas you people don't belong here, we were here first, that kind of claim to access and exclusion based on arguments about identity is also something which has really been on the rise in the last few decades, and it's a change from the period immediately after decolonization, when the idiom of land for the people was not really identity-based. It was the idea of, land to the tiller and the farmer and the peasant. But now it's very much more likely to be recognition of indigenous territory or ethnic-based movements. So these were the processes that we identified. And I think if you are not a Southeast Asia scholar, but if you did a similar exercise in other parts of the world, in South Asia or, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, you would identify a set of processes, and some of them would be similar and others would be different. Like in some cases, war would be a major process, changing people's access to land. It could also be climate, famine, drought. These were the ones that we came up with organically based on our research. So those were the processes. Oops, I'm really not doing well with this. Okay, so we have to do it twice, I guess. Okay. So then we asked ourselves, if those were the processes, what were the powers? How actually was this taking place? What kind of powers are at work in changing people's access to land? So initially, when we started the book, we all thought, well, it's markets. We're in a neoliberal era. It's like markets everywhere. It must be market processes that are changing people's access. And we were thinking, DeSoto and land titling and market processes would be the main thing. But when we actually looked across the region, we found that markets were only one of the elements changing people's access to land. And regulation, state-driven processes were certainly important. Regulations shaping the rules of who can be where, who can do what. This could also be customary rules, laws, zoning. That basically that declaration of you shall not be here doing this and you may be there doing that, that kind of force was an important one. And sometimes those regulations were actually anti-market. So it wasn't the case that market sort of expanding everywhere. In fact, they were very deliberately anti-markets. In a conservation zone, land markets may not appear, right? And if they exist, they must be suppressed. So some of these were anti-market mechanisms in which a regulation was going to be the one that defined what the use could be. So force, brute force, also important. Guns, fences, prisons, evictions, brute force in every area. And interestingly, you might think that the kind of in the Wild West, the more remote the area, the more brute force would be at play. And certainly in parts of the Philippines, that was true in the sense of sort of armed landlords and their militias and so on. But in fact, some of the most brutal exclusions that we tracked were peri-urban. It was that you're much more likely to have arson or eviction if you're on land which is extremely valuable. And so the peri-urban land was actually some of the most Wild Westy, the most violent, where people really could be excluded because someone would torch their house. And so, that was also interesting. And then the fourth force that we decided we should treat separately was this idea of legitimation. So this has to do with argument. It's the argument that you should not be here because this land should be a conservation area, or you should not be here because this land belongs to this ethnic group and not to you, or a corporation should be here because a corporation will bring jobs and development. Like, all of these are basically arguments. They're legitimations, they're kind of arguments about who should do what where, and they also have their own force. That was what we argued. Okay, so those were the powers. And then now I want to try to put this a little bit into, just to kind of summarize some of the main trends that we found across the region. First of all, a trend from flexible, overlapping, kinship and identity-based rules towards more rigid and state-created rules. And it was certainly the case that the kind of nook and cranny spaces where people used to find a little livelihood, a little spot to build a hut, plant a field, those were closing down. You know, informal access was decreasing. We certainly found closure of the land frontier. So Southeast Asia is a bit unique in this regard. Right? I think in much of South Asia, for example, like colonial era forest laws were much more rigid, and a forest boundary really meant something. Whereas in much of Southeast Asia, there have been forest boundaries since colonial times, but mostly they were not really enforced or not much enforced. So in effect, the forest frontiers were relatively open in much of the Southeast Asian region, which meant that landlessness was much lower than in South Asia or in China, for example, where landlessness has been well established historically. In parts of Southeast Asia, especially fertile lowland deltas, you've had landlessness for a couple of hundred years, but in much of the region, land was still available. You could still go to the land frontier. If you lived on the frontier, you could just go over the next hill and cut down a little bit more forest and create a garden for the next generation. So that opening of land frontiers, or open frontiers, that has shifted. Another kind of element that has shifted the conditions has to do with the intensified transnational involvement, sorry for the typo, more players and more actors. If you think about how we would talk about rural areas in the 60s and 70s, it was like the landlord, the peasant, the state, right? And now it's the NGO and the transnational treaties and organizations. A whole bunch of different actors are now on the scene, particularly donors, conservation NGOs, also corporations and banks, all with their part in this. So more transnational involvement and a larger range of actors. And finally, as a main process, definitely the rise of conservation, formalized private property, and arguments based on ethnicity and indigeneity. So these were the sort of the big trends. But now I want to zoom in on one of these processes, crop booms, which is the one that I'm most familiar with and most able to talk about, and to look at how crop booms have been changing Southeast Asia. So crop booms coming in two types. On the one hand, large-scale corporate plantations, oil palm, rubber, timber, shrimp, that kind of thing. On the other hand, small-scale farmers getting into boom crops. So this is a little bit counterintuitive for some people, because I'm going to argue that these crop booms have been especially intense in the most rural, remote, upland, highland regions, the kinds of regions where you might imagine, and people often do imagine, indigenous people will stay, close to nature, close to their food production practices. It's the sort of the idea of the remote, the rural, the indigenous, the stable, the static, or the repeating pattern. But in fact, Southeast Asian upland people have been enthusiastic participants in global markets for many centuries, certainly going back to the spice trade. But if you think about coffee, first came into Java around 1700, introduced via from Brazil, And Javanese farmers enthusiastically planted this new crop because they could make good money from it. Within a couple of decades, though, the Dutch had enforced a monopoly on coffee. Only they could buy the crop, and they forced the price down to less than 25% of the market price, whereupon Javanese coffee farmers tore up their coffee bushes in disgust, sensibly enough, and said, well, we're not going to produce this for free, and stopped producing, and from then on they had to be coerced. So you had a whole coercive regime of enforced coffee production, similarly for sugar. So the myth was born that the locals are not interested in market production. In fact, what they were not interested in was producing for markets for free. They were happy to do this kind of production so long as they could get a market price. And so this enthusiasm of remote people for global market crops is something we have to reckon with. And in some ways, it makes perfect sense. If you are living on the top of a mountain, it's not much use to you to plant enormous quantities of tomatoes, for example. First of all, you can't transport them. And secondly, the local market for tomatoes, you can crash it very easily if you overproduce tomatoes. Coffee, though, dried, put in sacks, cloves, dried, put in sacks, coffee, cocoa, cloves, very transportable, high value per weight. Even rubber, a little bit bulky, but you can store it for months or even years until the price is right. And if it comes to it, you can transport it on the back of a bicycle, right? So these global market crops are actually very attractive to people in remote areas with relatively limited transportation options because, like everybody else in the world, they need money. How else are you going to give shoes to your children and send them to school, right? So they too need money, and these global crops have been very attractive to them. And there's a long history of producing for these markets so long as the price is right. So crop booms then are not just a new thing. It's not a question of people who are baffled by markets or unfamiliar with markets, kind of discovering market production for the first time. There's always been markets for these crops. The question is, what are the terms under which people are able to access them and what they do with those opportunities? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about one kind of boom. So this is the one the oil palm story, the story of the kind of large-scale corporate end of the crop boom that I studied together with my colleague, Pujo Smadi. If you're wondering what is going on in this picture, these are oil palms which have been injected with Roundup, which is a herbicide to kill them, so that the new generation of palms can be planted underneath. So these are new palms. So it's a factory, basically. You plant these things when they get too tall to harvest, you kill them off, and you plant the new ones. When workers get too old and they retire, you recruit new ones. But once these plantation systems are installed, they stay. It's a continuous cycle. This picture is the one which kind of really gives me the creeps personally. 13,800 different concessions. That's actually Malaysia and Indonesia. But in Indonesia alone, the concessions cover 22 million hectares, which is a third of Indonesia's farmland. So that's what we were referring to in the book as corporate occupation. These are corporations which now occupy huge swaths of the countryside. And in a corporate land concession, a corporate plantation concession, the customary landholders, the people who were there before, are kicked out, right? No longer have the opportunity to farm. So these are multiple plantations back to back. So many of them, so thick on the ground that you get these kind of areas of white. But these are all separate plantation concessions blanketing huge amounts of Kalimantan, Malaysia, and Sumatra. Those are the main centres. So I look at this and I feel, well, something really enormous is transformed here, right? People can no longer live in the countryside in the way they used to because the corporation is now in charge, right? Has taken control over the land. So this is a close-up of the research area where Pujo and I studied, and this is what you can see when you dive into those white areas and you do a close-up. Basically, this is 5 different plantation corporations adjacent who have taken over the entire agricultural land of one sub-district. And the spaces where people can live, this is the river, the Caplis River, these are little remnant hamlets where people can still live in the kind of nooks and crannies between the plantations. But it's a highly saturated landscape, basically, of plantations. This is what the land looks like, completely clear-cut. If it's flat, it's set out on a linear grid. If it's hilly, it's terraced. But the main thing is that whatever was growing there before, rambutan trees, mango trees, rubber trees, rice farms, everything is gone. And that's what is coming up in its place. Together with the mills for processing the oil palm fruit. And this is actually one of those hamlets perched on the edge of the river with no land at all, right? So this is the corporate palm, right down to the back doors of these people who were just perched on the edge of the river, effectively landless. So that's what you see if you dive into this picture. That's more or less what it looks like. And in fact, if you dive into this picture, it looks like that everywhere where you see very high concentrations of white. Okay, so we had an artist conceptualize what this looked like. Pritchard came up with a definition of we use the title corporate occupation, being occupied by corporations, which I think you can see. He also came up with this idea of living with giants. And in the Indonesian translation of the book, we called it hidup bersama raksasa, like living with giants, literally. So this was his attempt, together with the artist, to conceptualize what it means when a corporation moves into your neighborhood. Basically, here you see, corporation is giant, enormously greedy, gobbling up resources, trampling flora and fauna, installing palms, and protected by some sort of a cabal of plantation officials and government officials sitting there with a tea, protected by army and military and a bunch of villagers saying, hey, 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 what about us? And, not getting too far with their complaints. So now I want to kind of make use of the analytical framework that I offered earlier around powers to use it to try to analyze what this transformation is about. So legitimation, one of the powers. What is the work that legitimation is doing in this scene? What I would say 3 myths. First of all, the myth of the lazy native. So this was the title of a brilliant book by Malaysian historian Syed Hussein Alatas, who wrote a book called The Myth of the Lazy Native. And what he was arguing was that this was a colonial era myth, which basically says that the natives on the spot are lazy and incompetent, and therefore you need corporations, plantation corporations, to come in and get the job done. So this myth is being repeated and used today, fundamentally unrevised, and we heard iterations of it everywhere in our plantation research, where officials and plantation managers would say, nothing was happening here before the corporations come, the locals didn't do anything, they didn't know how to use their land. And in order to say that, they had to overlook the fact that these villages were in fact producing rice, had produced rubber since the 1920s, and were sending tons of rubber down the river every month. But the myth which enables corporate occupation is the myth that the locals are useless and that corporations are needed to get the job done. Second myth, the myth of plantation efficiency. You might think that large scale, like the scale of those huge corporations, is efficient. Actually not. It turns out that, first of all, of all the land they occupy, they're only using about half of it. So half of it is just, they have control over it, but they're not using it. So not efficient from the point of view of land use. I think the locals could make more use of nook and cranny spaces, know how to choose which crops for which niche. But a plantation is a monocrop, right? If you can't grow palm there, you won't grow anything there. But they don't sort of know how to make good use of the resources. So not efficient from the point of view of land use, and not even especially efficient from the point of view of production. It turns out that plantations are corrupt, leaky machines. Quite often you drive along a plantation road and you see the palms near the road look quite healthy, and you walk 50 meters inside the plantation and you find palms that have never seen fertilizer in their entire life because someone stole the fertilizer or stole the budget or something, right? They actually aren't all that efficient from a production point of view. Smallholder farmers are much more efficient, and this is a very old finding in development studies. You know, small-scale farmers, they're not going to steal from themselves, right? And if they bought something expensive like fertilizer, they're going to make sure it gets onto the crop because they're just more efficient users of land and resources. And then there's the myth that corporations provide jobs. So the government of Indonesia has been using a figure of 20 million jobs. Really not true. At most, plantations absorb 1 worker per 5 hectares. So of around 16 million hectares or 15 million hectares of corporate palm, maybe 3 million employed, but definitely not 20, right? This can be very easily exaggerated. And that number does not take any account of all the jobs that were lost, all of the livelihoods that were lost, like what people were doing before, right? So it's a false equation. Okay, so those are the legitimizing myths in which I've just tried to poke a few holes. Force, also a power here, like brute force. On the one hand, you know, army and police involved in when the bulldozers move in, but also what I've been calling infrastructural violence. So once the landscape has been flattened and the palms are installed, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, you know, whatever was there before has gone now. The landscape has been irreversibly rearranged. The flora, the fauna, the way the rivers used to run, they've now been rerouted. All the roads lead to the mill. Like, so infrastructure designed for one purpose and set in place in a way that for the villagers makes it very hard to imagine, well, how could you change all this now? Like, you can't imagine how you could go back to how things were. So there's a violence in the infrastructure itself, and once you've installed the occupying force, you don't really even need guns and guards because the occupier is already there and you can't remove them. So you're stuck living with the system. Law is also, regulation law is also a force here. Land law favors the corporations, that's not surprising. Law is working in their favor. And the protective laws, even Indonesian laws, which are highly pro-corporate, have protected clauses in them. Like, you are supposed to negotiate with the villagers. You are supposed to have a setback between the plantation and the village. You're not really allowed to do this, like build like that. Like, that's against the law. But who's enforcing the law? No one. So this is a problem where officials and politicians are officially tasked with protecting the corporations, with the argument that corporations bring jobs and development. Therefore, it's the job of the government to facilitate, and not just kind of under-the-table collusion, but official arrangements in which corporations are protected and law doesn't work. So market is an interesting one, right? Because based on my arguments about laziness, in fact, if it was left to market processes, the corporations would collapse. They only exist because they're massively subsidized by virtually free land, highly subsidized labor, and highly subsidized capital. So if you actually had market forces, you wouldn't have plantations. So in a sense, the way market is working is like an anti-market. It's a suppression of the market. If it was left to market forces, then smallholders would actually outcompete them, as they have with other crops. So in the 1920s, rubber plantations came into Indonesia, and by the 1930s, smallholders were taking over. Now, more than 80% of the rubber is grown by smallholders, basically because they outcompete the plantations. They are more efficient. They can grow more at lower cost, and they can weather, market ups and downs better than corporations can. So that's how markets work in this scene. Okay, so that's one kind of transformation, and now I want to talk about a completely different kind. And this is the one that I looked at in my book, Land's End. Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier. And these are highland cocoa farmers. These are cocoa pods. And these are what you might call indigenous highlanders. And this is the remarkable thing. So this is global cocoa production, a graph I found. And the pink is the Côte d'Ivoire, historical center of cocoa production, and the red is Ghana. And this is Indonesia. Went from 0 to 3rd place in global cocoa production in a period of less than 20 years. Who was it? It was people who lived in the mountains, people like this, small-scale farmers living in very rugged conditions who found that cocoa would grow on their land and the market was good, and they eagerly jumped into it. So very modest people. So this is a cocoa farmer's house. It's just a little hut, right? And this is precious cocoa trees. And this family had 200 cocoa trees on which they were hoping to base their future. And of course, some of them succeeded and many of them failed. But the point is they changed the course of history, right? I mean, they eagerly adopted this market crop. No one forced them into it. They thought that they would benefit from it, and they took that path. So if we look at the kinds of powers which were involved in this case, the legitimation was coming from the people themselves, the desire to be modern, the desire to have cash, send children to school, be like other people. Why should our children not have shoes? Doesn't seem fair. Why should our children, another generation, grow up illiterate? Like they could see the march of progress around them and they wanted to be part of it. So this desire is a very important force. They also wanted to overcome the insecurity linked to the El Nino cycle. So although one can romanticize kind of indigenous farming, it is classically fairly vulnerable to the elements, especially dryland farming like this. Like irrigated land is more stable. But for these people, El Nino droughts, which came along every 4 to 7 years, were catastrophic events when all of their rice and corn shriveled up and died. And even though they had 25 different varieties of corn and different varieties of rice and did the best they could to manage these conditions through their knowledge of how to diversify their production, 7 months of drought is all going to shrivel up and die, basically. So they had their own evaluation that the way they were living was not the way they wanted to live. It was precarious in their view, and they also lacked cash. So they decided to go into cocoa production with the aim of improving their situation. And as I said, some succeeded, some failed. But it isn't the kind of transformation one could blame on a corporation or a misguided development scheme. It's not capitalism arriving like a steamroller to kind of flatten people. This was what I called capitalist relations emerging from below, indigenous capitalism. Force also operated among the people. So cocoa is a perennial, it's a tree crop. And in their own customary understanding, when you plant a tree, it means you've made an individual claim to land. So if someone plants a coconut tree or a mango tree, no one will mess with it, right? Because you planted that tree, now the tree is yours, as is the land underneath it. So as people started to plant cocoa, it had its own kind of exclusionary force, and the people it was excluding was their own neighbors and kin. Before, land had circulated in a shifting cultivation system. Once you've planted trees on it, it's now owned by the person who planted the trees. So it was an exclusion, a forceful exclusion by means of trees that operated among the people themselves according to their own logic, right? Their own understanding of what it means to plant a tree in terms of claims to ownership. State law was not very relevant. I think actually this area was defined as a forest zone, but the forest department had no interest in this area because it had long been farmed. There's no valuable timber, there's no teak, there's nothing really that the forest department was very interested in. So state law was not very relevant. And the market, in this case, played a huge role, right? People spotted a market opportunity, as the cocoa boom was taking off across the island of Sulawesi. many people were getting into it, and these highlanders decided to get into it too, and what I trace in the book is the way that market opportunity is like a shift from responding to a market opportunity is one thing, there's a market for my carrots, I can sell carrots, everyone needs money, to if I can't sell my carrots at the market price, I won't be able to feed my family, and then I'm going to mortgage my land, and I'm going to go into debt, right? So that shift from market as opportunity to market as compulsion, I can't really go into it in too much detail, but that's really the process that I describe in the book. So market was a huge force operating in this situation, but it wasn't, as I said earlier, because Highlanders were baffled by markets, that they were sort of innocents who didn't understand money or debt or anything like that. They had long experience. They used to grow tobacco to export to the Netherlands. In the 1820s, it was shown that it was shown in cargo manifests. These people have been planting cash crops of different kinds for a long time. The difference with cocoa was that it was a perennial and had this consequence of enclosing and privatizing land, which set all kinds of other dynamics in play. So, markets work differently. Okay, so to wrap up, what I've tried to show just through kind of I've only picked one process, crop booms, and I've only focused on one arena, changing land relations. I could focus on labor or education, other things, right? But I've taken this path through labor and then specifically through crop booms to show that rural Southeast Asia is not static. It's definitely transforming, but not in a linear way, not in a way in which one could say everyone is on the same path. Like the people in those little enclaves, they're not really on a path to anything, certainly not on a path towards improved livelihoods or even modernity. In fact, they look across at the plantations and the workers there who have good houses and pension and health schemes and say, well, that's the modern life, and we'd love to have that too, but we here in this little enclave stuck with no land, we don't have access to any of that. It's just taunting us there across the river. We're just the audience. We can look at it, but we don't have it. So people are exposed to new forces and new desires, new hopes, but they don't necessarily they're not necessarily in the position to actually benefit from them. So these processes and powers are multiple. New practices, new positions, new identities, being a landless person, for example. In the case of ethnic territorial movements, definitely, new identities being forged or being articulated. Diverse actors involved, governments, NGOs, corporations, small-scale farmers, all of them are actors in this scenario. There's not just one kind of motivator or initiator of change. It's coming from all sides. And lastly, I would say that urban dwellers in Indonesia are largely oblivious to these changes because as I discussed with some of my young Indonesian colleagues earlier this evening, Indonesian media really doesn't cover the rural. And urban people actually have a little clue about what's going on in the countryside. A map like that plantation zone map with all the white would be utterly new and quite shocking to most urban Indonesians who are not aware, are not informed, are not really paying attention to how rural areas are transforming. If anything, they're hearing the myths. Corporations bring jobs and development. And if there's a problem, well, that must just be bad actors. It's true that some companies behave badly, but on the whole, the assumption is that this is a good thing and it's, along the march of progress. And the kind of knowledge which would question that, question the myths, question the data, question the direction of change, is not something which you find discussed or debated in the media, in education curricula, and so on. So I think that's sort of why I think it's important to think about these issues. I do think it's different in other parts of Southeast Asia, and I don't want to claim expertise on all of it, but I would say Thailand, for example, farmers from the northeast of Thailand occupied Bangkok, a central intersection in Bangkok, for many months and caused enormous headache to the urban population of Bangkok, who was forced to reckon with the fact that rural people were there, were upset, were making demands, and were interrupting traffic, right? So they had a way of forcing themselves into popular consciousness, including among an urban elite that in general is not very interested in or aware of what was going on the Thai countryside, right? So, different parts of the region, different kinds of media presence, perhaps also different kinds of policy presence, right? Indonesia is a country which has no peasant party, no peasant unions, for historical reasons of which you're all aware. It did have those parties in the 1960s, a very well-organized communist party, third largest in the world after China and the Soviet Union, with peasant unions and plantation workers unions that were huge and well-organized. Like, there was a time when the question of the rural and how the country would be organized, in whose interest, was in fact a matter of public debate. But since the massacres of 1965, those parties are gone, the unions have gone, and they've not reformed. So they've not come back. So 60 years later, there's still a crushing absence of the kinds of political debate that used to go on around the question of development and the rural sector. In other countries, I think, Vietnam, for example, the Vietnamese Communist Party still has solid roots in the rural and ignores the peasant population at its peril, right? Their legitimacy still hinges in part on the rural constituency. Thailand, a brilliant book by Anthony Walker called Thailand's Political Peasants, in which he makes the argument that the Thai military concluded that rather than massacring the communists, as they did in Indonesia, they chased them away into the countryside, but they would then outcompete them by actually providing development and infrastructure that the people wanted, so that they would wean people away from the Communist Party because the state was providing, right? So a very different kind of political settlement in the basically different resolutions of the Cold War. Vietnam, one example, Thailand, another, Indonesia, another, right? So it's not the same politically, just as it's not the same in terms of the processes, but I hope I've put some of this into the room. Thank you.
Tania, do you want to come and sit here and you'll be a bit more comfy for the questions? Or do you want to stay? You can stay there if you like. If you want to stand up, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, so we will, thank you so much for your incredibly interesting talk. We'll now open the floor to questions. I have to remind people online that if you're typing a question, which apparently is going to pop up on this iPad, please put your name and affiliation. Yeah, Tim. Oh, there's a microphone coming. Okay.
Thanks very much, Tania. That was very interesting. Just one question. At the start, you gave us hard statistics about rural versus urban, and at the end, you gave us a statement about the political agency of rural people. But the obvious question is, does the distinction between urban and rural mean the same thing now as it did in 1990 or in 1890? Mm-hmm. And are we moving into a situation where actually it's hybrid, but also the act of calling people urban or rural is in itself a political act which might shut down how we understand who they actually are?
Should we just go one by one?
Yeah, I think go one by one for now. I might collect more later on.
Yes, I agree. It's a very clumsy instrument. And the question of how these boundaries are drawn in the different countries, what the classification, sometimes rural populations diminish overnight because boundaries were shifted, definitions were shifted. So there's nothing very solid about this. But I do think that, and I think it's, Jonathan Riggs writing about Thailand, he argues that is more than the soil, right? That rural ties live in a basically suburban environment. You can be anywhere in rural Thailand and your internet will work and you've got a road and your kids go to high school, and that they are very connected even if they live in a rural area. So not the same rural, you could say. So this is clearly a shorthand. I think in relation to the kinds of spaces where I've been working in Indonesia, it is really quite a different world, and people don't move in and out of the city that easily. In Java, they do much more so, constant traffic. People going to do casual labor, like building construction labor in Jakarta, back to the countryside, more of a circular thing. In Kalimantan, people might go to the city, try the bright lights, and after a couple of years, they're back, because there's actually nothing for them there. So it isn't the case that there are some jobs and prospects for these young rural people who have no future in the rural areas, but it's not clear that there's anything else for them. So it's that kind of blockage that I'm trying to highlight. But I agree with you, these are clumsy categories.
There's a question in front here.
Yes, my name is Stefano Bonfa, I'm from Oxford SDE. And the question is, I just want to reflect in, let's say, Europe or England. So the rural and, let's say, urban area, it looks there is some kind of similar here. I mean, a rural area is abandoned, and the solution maybe could be innovation. It could be from bottom up, building, give it to the community knowledge in order they can react. Because most of the problem comes from the policy. The policy, the politician, they don't have enough, let's say, data or knowledge, how, not to have a strategy based on knowledge. So what do you think about this comparison?
I guess, a lot of my work I focused on the kind of transformation I described with the cocoa farmers. Policy played no role in that, and it wasn't a question of the government needing to go to the countryside and kind of stimulate innovation where it was lacking. It turned out that these people themselves looked around and saw that people were prospering with a new crop and jumped in. So I think the question of where the dynamism comes from, the plantations, that's a policy decision to enable corporations to take over massive areas of land. So that is a kind of transformation which is generated from the top down, and people have to adapt to it. Some transformations are also generated in the other direction. So I think all of this is happening, and the question would be, if there's change, where's it coming from? What are the processes? What are the actors? What kinds of powers are at work? Is it the attraction of the market? Is it the force of direct violence? Or, where all of these processes and powers are at work.
There's a question in the third row. The lady with the... Yeah, it's coming in.
Thank you, Tania, for such an insightful discussion. I actually have two questions. The first one, you actually have mentioned this, and I don't want to put this question to certain temporalities, but I'm curious, what is the pattern after the exclusion in several areas that you have researched? I mean, in terms of political, that you are aware of, in terms of political economy, or after the exclusion, they are absorbed as a rural working class in the rural area, or they're migrating to the urban areas and then absorb again as a rural working class, or you see the pattern of exclusion and inclusion, and as you said, it's very dynamic and it depends on the power and processes and opportunities in both areas, if we can separate the places and the space. And the second question is, I think you have mentioned in your book Land's End about the paradox, the problematic of movement in Indonesia, and we see that in environmental movement, peasant movement, food sovereignty movement, the complexity of all this exclusionary practice are not being included in specific categories. In that sense, it's a bit exclusionary as well. How do you respond to that? And what do you think the most effective ways to acknowledge the transformation happening in rural area for social movements?
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, it's if you a sort of simple reading of Marx on enclosure, an ahistorical reading also would suggest that there's an enclosure, it produces a proletariat, and these people march off to the city and get absorbed into jobs, right? But it's not linear like that. And in fact, historically, as Marx is very well aware, there was a period of several centuries between the enclosure of the land and the rise of modern manufacturing to absorb all these workers. So there's nothing automatic connecting exclusion to absorption into jobs like you wish. But in fact, the jobs don't just appear when and where they're needed, because now there's people who need them. You can be excluded on the one hand and not included in anything else, right? So those people living in the enclaves that I described, they are not needed by the plantations. They have their own permanent workforce. Some of them get casual day labor at the plantations, but in our study, less than 20%. So most of those households are now landless and jobless. So, there's no sort of automatic connection between exclusion and inclusion. You lose one, but you get another. I think that the transition narrative suggests that, right? Farm to factory. So you may lose your access to farmland, but that's okay because you just march along to the city where you will be absorbed into an urban working class. But what if not? In fact, the pattern of migration in Indonesia is the opposite. It's urban lumpen, like unemployed urbanites who become plantation workers. So they go from the city to the country, or it's people from areas of Indonesia where landlessness, they're rural but they're landless, like from Java or NTT or NTB. Those are the people who become plantation workers in Kalimantan. So there's rural to rural and there's urban to rural, and it's not a single process of exclusion here, absorption there. On the question of movements, yes, as you know that I've written a bit about this, because it seems to me that in particular in relation to the indigenous peoples movement, I've written quite a bit about this, and to some extent conservation, based on an idea of customary communities as somehow naturally conservationist, in touch with nature, or anti-market, or anti-capitalist even. And this may be the case, but you cannot assume, right? As I've argued, people like that have been jumping into markets for centuries if they spot a good opportunity, not always with the same consequences. So if you imagine the first coffee boom, let's say in Sumatra and Java, like you can go into coffee, jump into a market, but you've still got an open land frontier. So if you fail, you just can clear another little piece of forest and you go back to being a rice farmer. So the consequences of market involvement have changed because of all the other exclusions that I described, right? The conservation boundaries, the titling, the zoning, etc. Right? So these people have been involved in market dynamics for centuries, not always with the same very serious and permanent consequences that they have now. But it's always something which needs to be attended to. And if you look at the way the Indonesian government is responding to the question of indigeneity, it's to say, we will recognize Indonesian people, indigenous people, but we define them as non-market, right? People who do not produce for markets, who only produce for their own subsistence. I mean, you practically have to be a hunter-gatherer to qualify for this very, very tiny slot. So it's like it appears that they've recognized, and you think this is progressive, but actually they've defined it so narrowly that most of Indonesia's customary landholders, which is most people, cannot qualify, right? So I think movements have been part of that problem of sort of idealizing, sometimes romanticizing, and defining very narrow niche. So what I've been recommending is, you could say, I'm an anthropologist, right? Like more ethnography. Let's find out what the people are up to. What are they doing? What kinds of transformation are they affected by, but also creating. Like, what are their aspirations? How are they changing the course of history by the transformations that they themselves have set underway? And movements need to be in tune with their constituency. Otherwise, they will be movements without a constituency. You know, advocating something, but without people who they claim to represent people, but those people actually are off on some other pathway, right? So I think it's interesting. The Communist Party back in the 60s, they had a sort of policy of sending young cadre into the countryside, and what they were told to do was to shut up and listen and learn and observe and talk to, you know, just try to understand what the peasants were up to before they tried to tell them what to do. There's a good message there. Yeah.
I'm just going to take 2 questions at a time now, if that's all right.
Okay.
Deborah and then Mandy. Deborah, if you wave at them. Yeah.
Hi, thanks Tania. I'm Deborah from Anthropology. I sort of belong to the same generation as you, I guess, in as much as I went off to a remote rural area and hung out with people who grow stuff. And I just wondered, have you got any insight into why it is that sort of, you know, orientation in anthropology with Journal of Peasant Studies, we've all published there and things like that, has shifted, as you say, quite so radically. I don't know if it's shifted elsewhere as well, or if it's something about assumptions about urbanization that seem to be going on. But I just wondered if you had any insights, because I feel that the future of the rural world seems to be at stake somehow.
Sorry?
The future of the rural world seems to be at stake.
In our own academic practices, yeah.
And then just Mandy, just behind. Two rows back. So.
Hi Tania, first of all, thanks a lot for the presentation. And since you mentioned Malaysia, I might as well break cover. I am from Malaysia. And I mean, since we're talking about oil palm plantations, right, I can't help but to wonder, like, you know, first of all is, have you ever come across like Malaysia's history of felder schemes? Because one funny thing is that the world's largest palm oil producer is actually felder. And the funny history about felder is that it is actually a land settlement scheme that's created by the Malaysian government in the 60s. And the main intention was to really resettle, like, you know, rural Malays at that time into, like, you know, productive cash crops, right? And one of the main cash crops of the time is palm oil. And the question here, therefore, is there is also an argument that in Malaysia, because of the land settlement schemes, there is never a true rural, right? Which that felder, because of the prominence of felder schemes in Malaysia, that Malaysia went through some sort of a semi-urban to an urban transition. So I'm just trying to see, like, you know, it's just an interesting case study to share with you, Tania. And secondly is, maybe in contrast to, like, what you are studying in Indonesia now, do you also kind of like observe maybe a similar pattern? Or do you think, like, again, because of how diverse Southeast Asia is, there may be more, like, you know, complexities to that?
Great.
Okay, thank you. I'll go in reverse. So, you know, the felder schemes were interesting, right? Because it was the image of settling the peasant households on the land, give everybody 2 hectares of productive oil palm, and you create a landed peasantry, and that would be a poverty reduction process for Malaysia. But what happened was that rural Malays took off for the city. You know, the government was quite successful with rural education and also with job creation in the cities. And so now those felder schemes have re-corporatized. They're no longer based on smallholder farms. Corporations run them and Indonesians do the work. So it's the reverse of, you could say it's a successful agrarian transition, right? Out of agriculture, from farm to factory, from country to city in Malaysia, which is why the oil palm story in Malaysia is very different from Indonesia. In Malaysia, like, rural families lack labor. Old couples, their children are gone. They can't farm their land. If a company comes along and wants to farm it and give them a nice rent, they'll say, great, we get some income in our old age. The children are gone anyway. Indonesia, the children are not gone. There's nowhere for them to go. There's no jobs. There's no jobs in the city. There's nothing going for them. So for them, it's a completely different meaning. Now the corporation has taken all the land. I, young farmer, would love to grow oil palm, like smallholders love oil palm because it's very lucrative. They say if you have 6 hectares of oil palm, you can send your children to the university. 2 hectares feeds the family, 2 hectares feeds the farm, 2 hectares is your investment fund for education and land purchase, etc. So that you can prosper in the countryside. You don't want to go to the city, there's nothing for you there. If you want to be rich, be an oil palm smallholder. But the corporations already have all the land. So that's a very different situation. So same crop, different transformation dynamics in Malaysia and Indonesia produces a really different scenario, which is why, we have to look at these processes, what's going on in the countryside. It's not really the same thing, even with the same crop. Yeah. On this question of why did we go away from the rural? Well, it's interesting because when I first told my husband, who's there, I was going to publish in Journal of Peasant Studies, he laughed. It was like, like how ridiculous, how backward, But in fact, Journal of Peasant Studies is the most successful journal ever, right? It's the top-ranked journal in development studies, and I think it's also in anthropology, right? So they're oddly an arcane format. The Journal of Peasant Studies has become wildly popular. Why? Partly, new demographic, I would say, attracting scholars who are working on social movements and farmers' movements. It's also expanded the questions. It's not just, the state, the moneylender, and the peasant, and the landlord, like the old cast of characters. People are interested in food politics and environment. So it's sort of morphed, into adjacent areas. Like agrarian studies is now environmental studies and climate change and food security and SDGs and they all publishing in Journal of Peasant Studies, but if you actually look at the topics, they've sort of expanded. So that would be on the positive side to say that actually people are attending to the rural, but not necessarily in the same terms, even though they're still publishing in the same journal. But that's only part of it. I think in anthropology, in our discipline, definitely a turn away from the rural. I've had a couple of Pakistani students looking at rural Pakistan, but in general, very few graduate students in my career who have really wanted to do the kind of work that I do. So it does suggest that it's not very sexy. This is regarded as a bit arcane.
Okay, we have 5 questions in the room and 1 online. So this gentleman here in the scarf has been waiting, and the gentleman in the grey at the back has been waiting. So if we have gentleman in the scarf first, and then you. Yeah.
Hi Tania, thank you for your talk. I am one of those who works on rural parts. I'm here.
Oh, okay.
And I'm interested,
looking around for you.
And I'm interested in the Journal of Peasant Studies, so here you are. My question is about I also see the agrarian transformation in my fieldwork area, which is in the Indian Western Himalayas. And there are these changing aspirations. So how do we represent agrarian transformations and relation to landscape? In your way, you are showing, contrasting them with the plantation. So again, you're using the modernity vocab to show them they are efficient, they are productive. You're questioning the myth of lazy, native. Should we use that vocab and show the changing aspirations and want to be a part of the development journey of the state? Or do we...
Sorry, want to be part of what?
To be a part of the state, of the development state, modernizing state. Or the alternative is coming from Latin America, where the question is representing indigenous autonomy, pluriversal ontology. So do we represent agrarian as the plot or as a more efficient plantation?
Great. And the gentleman in the grey just there with the curly hair. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tania. I really appreciate your move away from overtaking urban scholars that want to see everything as urban. Some of them going as extreme as calling for seeing the whole world as planetary urbanization. And they identify certain processes influenced by Lefebvre as Marxism, capitalist relations entering a new phase of urban processes. of accumulation. And seems like the processes that you are offering is an antidote to that for us to identify what is rural through processes, not like the first question, ask me what is urban, what is rural. What are the processes of rural capitalist relations and urban ones on the other hand? And if I can add one sub-question to this, is my own interest in nomadism. Would you also categorize a third category of nomads that are not rural, urban, rural, and then pastoral nomads or other forms of nomads? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to take those two?
Okay, sure.
I don't want to give you too many in one go.
Yeah, okay, great. So people's relationship to the landscape, right? I've had this debate with anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena, for example, who's written about Pachamama and the Latin American sort of people's attachment to ancestral lands, and she said, I said, well, either I'm a really bad anthropologist and I just don't notice these things, or Southeast Asia is actually quite different. Like in my own ethnographic experience, what I find is that people are highly pragmatic in their relationship to the natural environment. So there may very well be spirits in that tree, but if we need to cut the tree down, because that's a good place for a farm, we'll just ask the spirits very nicely and give them an offering and say, please move over to this tree. We've prepared it for you because I'm sure you'll understand, we too need to live and this is good farmland, right? So a pragmatic relationship to, you could say, sort of enlivened, inspirited land. But it's not a conservationist one where this tree has to be there. It's like, you can't make a farm if you don't cut down trees. Like, that's just in the nature of things, right? And then they said, well, these are ordinary trees. You have to cut them. That's how you make a garden. So I think this question of how people relate to elements of the kind of natural landscape is something that you really have to look into in each situation. So farmers in our plantation world were horrified by the injecting of the trees with Roundup. And they gave it a moral reading. They said, these trees gave everything. These palms gave all the oil that you asked them to. And in their old age, you're not just going to let them die gracefully. You're going to kill them off. Like, that is just bad treatment, right? So it was interesting, right? I mean, they because they also saw their own mortality. It's like old workers get kicked out. Old trees get killed off. So they made these comparisons and were unhappy, but they also cut down trees if they need to, right? It depends a little bit on the conditions. But the one thing about Latin America is that it's overwhelmingly urban, right? And most countries of Latin America have 80 to 90% of the population lives in cities. This is not true in Asia, right? It's Latin America and Asia are really different from this point of the importance of agriculture and the importance of rural livelihoods. In India, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in China, in Pakistan, like the rural is still the place where most people live and get their livelihoods, and this is not true in Latin America. So, different continents, different dynamics. In terms of planetary urbanism, I mean, I don't know how helpful it would be to regard, Eric Wolf called plantations factories in the fields, right? And he said that, in fact, the original industrial manufacturing form was the plantation. So that kind of parallel has been drawn for a long time now. How far you get with that, what really is, what is the helpfulness of making those kinds of comparisons? I don't know. I mean, as you can imagine, I reacted to that planetary urbanism quite thinking, hold on a minute. So, what planet do you live on? Because where I hang out, it doesn't look like that, at all. But I also feel it's dangerous, right? Because it means that as I started off by saying, if it's all the urban in the future, you don't need to worry about this stuff, because sooner or later it will empty out and people will just march off to the city, as if it's like the way that kind of thinking enables this lazy transition narrative that I think I'm insisting on. Nomads, I mean, how often are nomads voluntary versus forced? You know, people who are on the move because they've been, they've lost access to the resources that they were relying on, and now they're kind of set loose. I mean, nomad sounds a little bit like you would choose a nomadic life, and I think again distinctions have to be made there. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, the online question has disappeared.
Oh,
maybe. So we have 8 minutes left. There are 3 people who've been waiting very patiently. David, the gentleman next to him in the striker jumper, and Mukalika. David's just here in the second row. And then that might be it. Then you just choose whether to answer. Just David, if you put your hand up. So.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I mean, I guess one of the things that you've talked about so comprehensively is a kind of erasure of rural history and the way in which, you know, rural pasts have been sort of swept away. And I just wondered, I mean, I've just become quite interested in where these memories go and, you know, to what extent representations of the rural sort of reappear, or in ways that are not just, I think you mentioned the lazy peasant narrative as still being very strong. But are there not other ways in which the rural gets represented in, you know, popular culture, in romantic, in narrations of past struggles and solidarities? And
thank you. And the gentleman next to you? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a couple of points. I think you said, if I heard you rightly, that when people started planting trees, property rights became important. And I wondered if you have an explanation for why that happened. I can think of a comparable case in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, noted by the German-Swiss anthropologist Lorenz Wecker, that when the indigenous people started planting mandarins, suddenly the issue of property rights became important. And the way that could be explained was this, that prior to that...
Just keep it a little bit short. Just we're running out of time slightly, sorry.
Sweden farming did not need anything more than temporary use rights. But the fruit growing trees were perennial, and therefore property rights became important. The other point is that the issue about exclusion without inclusion. This has been termed dispossession without proletarianization in the context of India. My question is, the debates on land grab, resistance and struggles for land grabs has kind of polarized between the struggle against expulsion and struggles for incorporation. But when you have expulsion without inclusion, you neither have the struggles, struggles for expulsion don't get you anywhere, but there is also no scope for struggles for incorporation, and people kind of drop out into a kind of backless place where there is no biopolitics which is concerned with it.
And just Mukalika has been waiting for, apparently it's a very small question. Very small question.
Very small. I really appreciate your refocusing attention on rurality. I've been doing this for 20 years in India, where, of course, like you were saying, 2/3 of the population lives in rural India. So it's a very significant population. And one of the reasons for academic erasure of the interest in rurality, there may be many. I wondered whether you have thoughts on the interest that economists have in this. And I'm very aware of, we're sitting in the LSE, our Nobel Prize winning economist, Arthur Lewis, after whom the economics building is now named at LSE, was responsible, he got the Nobel Prize for proposing the Lewis turning point, right? Which is such an important contribution to that transitional narrative. Surplus labor from rural is absorbed in the urban, and then it stabilizes, and that causes rise of rural labor wages. Utter nonsense. I mean, that just hasn't happened in large parts of the world. So have economists just lost interest in this question, and whether, especially because you seem to be attuned to Indonesian academic discourses, is there any hope there in that discussion? Thank you.
So, Tania, you have 3 minutes. It's a minute per question.
1, 2, 3. Where did memories go? So I think, again, this is quite nationally specific, right? I would say that Indonesia does not, as far as I'm aware, you Indonesians in the audience, I know there's many of you, I've never seen a kind of a romantic myth of the rural. Peasants are always presented as idiots. Maybe there's a little bit of the sense of like community, family that gets riffed on the rural, but in general, there isn't a kind of a category of the campesino as the hero of the revolution, or as you have in China. You know, it's like, I haven't really seen a romance of the rural in general. So where do the memories go? You have to first of all, have a figure of the noble peasant in order to mourn the loss thereof. In terms of why trees produce property. So I call this the labor theory of property. Cutting trees produces property, and planting trees also produces property, because in both cases labor is involved in the transformation of the initial state. So if you clear land throughout Southeast Asia, pioneers get a property right. In some contexts, they can pass this on to their descendants. In other contexts, it reverts to the community, but the rights of the pioneer, because of their investment in clearing land, are acknowledged, at least during the lifetime, sometimes beyond. Planting tree, if you plant like a coconut tree or a mango tree or something, it's yours. It's understood that planting trees creates property. Again, sometimes this is then inherited by multiple generations, so it becomes kind of collective because lots of people descend from the planter of the rambutan tree, they live really long. But the theory that labor produces property is the kind of the key, and I think that's true right across the Southeast Asian region, and probably in the situations that you're describing as well. So the difference with cocoa is that you're not just planting one tree, you're planting a whole field. So now you're not just claiming rights to an individual tree in the land around it, but you're enclosing territory because you're planting many. So it's like the old theory, the labor theory of property, kind of morphed into a new situation in which people are planting fields of perennials and using this as a vehicle of enclosure. So in my 1 minute. On the question of exclusion without, yes, I mean the struggle for incorporation. I wrote a paper, which I know you know, Adnan, on what I call it, centering labor in the land grab debate, which was precisely about that, right? To me, the drama was always the labor. Like, land can pass hands, but what is anybody thinking about where all the people will go and what they will do? And even the promoters of these large-scale land investments acknowledged, the World Bank acknowledged, that the jobs generated were tiny and far fewer than the jobs lost. So even the economists recognized that there is no labor absorption in that form of development. Most of these forms of corporate agriculture are labor displacing. So plantations, oil palm, 1 worker per 5 hectares, rubber 1 for 1, the crop matters. If it's soy in Amazonia, it's like 100 hectares managed by, 1 guy with his tractor, highly labor displacing. So, this question of the labor absorption always has to be scrutinized, for sure. What's happened with the economists? Have they lost interest? So, there was a moment when jobless growth was being named as a thing, like in India. I've even saw some economists talking about it in Indonesia, that there had been corporate investment, but it was jobless. Growth was jobless. I even saw the Indonesian Minister of Finance acknowledge that in a 10-year period in which there had been a large increase in foreign investment, the number of jobs generated was almost none. In fact, the main jobs generated in the same period were small-scale farmers, absorbing more and more people on the land, right? So the economists sort of sometimes acknowledge it, jobless growth, but then Indonesia passes an omnibus law called, catch it, the Law for Job Creation, which is an investment law eviscerating land and environmental protections and labour protections in the name of jobs and development. So even though they may acknowledge that in fact the jobs are not generated by this kind of corporate path, they still do it in the name of jobs and development. So there is a mismatch, and I don't know where the economists are on that, but it's like the studies may show it, but the discourse still continues down the transition path, which is mighty stubborn, right? However much evidence you throw at it, this myth is still there. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for your engagement. Many, many apologies if you didn't get a chance to ask your question. And Tania, thank you so much for your fantastic talk.